stopping,
justice.
then that means, like, I agree with you. The
I
bullets
wasn't
need to
talking about
stop.
Gaza justice. I was talking about Palestinian
Yeah,
justice
but Gaza is part of
overall
the
over the last
Palestinian.
50 years.
Gaza is part
Yeah.
of the Palestinian fabric. Gaza what didn't magically appear out of nowhere. Like Palestinians were violently displaced and dispossessed from their homes through
Yeah.
a system of colonization and dispossession and forced to move into Gaza, which was then surrounded and enclaved, and that created Gaza. It's not something that
Yeah.
appeared out
I
of
mean,
thin
I'm
air.
happy to I'm happy
But
to
I agree with
argue
you
all this. I mean,
on the point. I
it was
agree. Can I
yeah,
just finish this one
yeah.
point? I agree with you that we can't talk about peace if the bullets are not stopping. So I think on that end, we're on the same page that we need a ceasefire now. And as you're speaking about that time, I'm just like seeing some parallels between the things you're describing and Joe Biden's presidency and what's defining it, such as like high inflation rates, starting out popular and then ending not popular at all.
Yeah.
And in the backdrop of disastrous foreign policy um, across the globe. And so I'm wondering if you feel like
I mean, I take issue with that. I don't know how much you want to like
yeah, I
how
I
much
want
you
to I
want me to
want
be
I want to hear
I don't
your
know how
take
much you
on
want me
that.
to be disputatious, but yeah,
Go ahead.
I
Go
don't
ahead. Let
believe.
me let me
Yeah.
I want you to I was gonna see if you can draw parallels between the stuff you're describing and the stuff that we're facing today.
Yeah.
And is it similar to why Democrats have lost so badly around this time around? Um, does is there lessons from history here that we can pull from?
Yes, there are always lessons from history, but it's important to understand that history doesn't really repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And
Mark
so
Twain,
what
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And the other, great line that is maybe wrongly attributed to Mark Twain is a lie makes it halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's important, and this was something that I studied in college.
Mm-hmm.
I took a very, for me, very influential class. It was called Thinking in Time, the Uses and Abuses of History.
Right.
It's very important to look at historical figures contextually.
Right.
Just to give you an example from Jimmy Carter in his earlier life. So I'm very hard on him, not very hard on him, but I don't spare him
Mm,
on the really awful campaign he ran in 1970 to be governor of Georgia.
right.
And he used racial code words and what we call dog whistles.
Mm,
He never used the N word or anything like that because
right.
he was
But he understood the
from
time that he
boyhood.
was in.
Yeah, from boyhood, he was well, no, it was that he had to make a choice. At one point, he said to me, in one of our many interviews when I was pressing him on that campaign, where he had said nice things about George Wallace, who he privately despised.
Mm,
He said, "Look, I had a choice. I could either be in the civil rights movement or I could be governor of
yes.
Georgia." And I wanted to
Yes.
be governor of Georgia. So I think that, you know, a lot of times, and I don't think I'm going too far in saying, especially younger people, and I was certainly like this when I was young,
Mm,
they do what Obama called making the perfect the enemy of the good.
mm,
So they go, and this to me is an essential concept for people to understand. They make the perfect the enemy of the good. So
okay.
when somebody makes some progress on something,
Mm-hmm.
instead of going, you know what, that's good, I wish he had done more,
Mm,
they say, fuck him.
yeah.
He's not with me on Gaza, whatever the issue is.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't think like contextually. So the reason that this comes to mind is you say that Joe Biden had a disastrous foreign policy all around the world. So I think reasonable people can disagree about his policy toward on the Middle East,
Mm,
and you can even, with good reason, be extremely critical of it. Um, but you need to do that in the context of what he did to strengthen NATO after Trump, in his first term,
Mm,
badly weakened it, and to take the time to understand why it was so important that Joe Biden responded firmly after
mhm,
Putin invaded Ukraine, and what a overall really, really good job he did in Europe in bringing together our allies, expanding NATO. And if Putin had overrun Ukraine, showing
mhm.
that might makes right, Moldova would have been next, and then countries in Eastern Europe,
Right.
and he would have reassembled the old Soviet Union, which was his dream.
Mm,
And still is his dream. And if that had started to happen, we would have had to probably triple our
mm,
defense budget
right.
just to protect democracies in Western Europe
Mm,
and Eastern Europe. So, people need to understand that all of these guys, including Jimmy Carter,
mm,
anybody who's president, even if it was, pick your favorite politician, somebody who you really love,
mhm,
if that person became president, he or she would also have a mixed record. It's
mhm.
in the nature of the complexity of governing.
Right.
There's only one modern politician who doesn't have a mixed record, and that's Donald Trump.
Mm. We'll touch on him in a little bit.
Yeah,
And thank you for offering that analysis. I do tend to think that a society should be judged based on how the most vulnerable in that society are impacted and affected or treated. And the way in which the reason why I am so harsh on Biden is because the most vulnerable in our global community has been negatively impacted under him, at least from my vantage point. But
well,
moving
that's I
from
mean
that,
that's assuming that there would be something that he could do about it. I mean, the assumption behind that question is that if the United States cut off all arms sales to Israel and lectured Netanyahu about how he should treat the Palestinians, which, by the way, Joe Biden has done from the start, that would somehow make a difference. And I think we know enough about Netanyahu that he would be pursuing the same policy. So, sometimes there's a little bit of a sense that, the United States is omnipotent. And actually, the history of the last, you know, 60 years is that Vietnam being only one of many examples, Iraq is another, trying to do nation building there.
mm,
There are tremendous limits to power.
right.
And again, this is something that I think I had less of a sense of when I was young and very
Mm,
much against the war in Vietnam, very much against apartheid in South Africa, engaged in campus demonstrations on that. And, and when I look back, I like the passion that I had,
mm.
but I think that I was not thinking contextually enough about these very complicated issues.
Well, I appreciate that. I still do think that there is much more that Biden could have done.
I agree with
So
that.
many,
I'm
so
not
many,
disagreeing with that.
so
Yeah.
many experts have
Yeah.
given him solutions, sounded the alarm,
Well,
uh,
are there
have
solutions? Like what
yeah.
would be a solution? I mean, that
Well,
I don't want to,
well,
I'm not sure you want to,
I
be
mean, I
like,
mean, I don't want to make this about Biden's
yeah, yeah,
policy.
but
Uh,
I'm just curious, like what is a solution that would
yeah, I mean,
solve
like
the problem of Gaza?
yeah, like, well, first of all, the United States, we unilaterally and unconditionally support every action that the state of Israel takes, which there are allies. So I understand why they do stuff like that. But if we're going to talk about Jimmy Carter's life, he supported ending the expansion of settlements. He supported ending the apartheid state.
So did Joe
He,
Biden. Joe Biden has been against settlements
yeah,
for
there is difference
40
between
years. but
I do think there's
strongly
difference
against.
between lip service and actual
No, it's
policy.
not lip
And I do
service.
think that
We need to keep with the actual history of this, which I know how many
under Joe
very,
Biden,
very well.
more Palestinians have died uh, than under any other president
Well,
in human
that is a
history. We
horrible,
have
horrible thing. And I'm not defending that in any fashion. We need to be clear about the argument that I'm making. I'm not
mhm,
defending that, that just horrendous loss of life. But what I was questioning you on is
mhm,
this idea that Joe Biden being against settlements was quote lip service. So at the beginning of the Obama administration,
mhm,
and I wrote two books about Barack Obama,
mhm,
Joe Biden goes to the Middle East. He has been a longtime supporter of the state of Israel.
right.
And at the time he's in the Middle East, Netanyahu insults him in a grievous fashion by actually having his government announce new settlements
Mhm,
at the time of his visit, which was very, very embarrassing for Biden. And to say that he was pissed off about it
mhm,
would be a gross understatement. It
right.
caused a mini crisis, would be too strong, but Obama and Biden were batshit angry over that because the United States has been against expanding these settlements since the Camp David Accords of 1978, when
Right.
Carter brought the issue up with Begin, and actually the about half of what he wanted to accomplish in the aftermath of Camp David was not possible because of Begin's settlement policy. So this idea that, except under Trump, who loved the settlements, and he has a new ambassador, Mike Huckabee, who wants to annex the West Bank. But under Democratic presidents, and in fairness, particularly under George H.W. Bush, where Jim Baker got in trouble for saying "fuck the Jews" at one point because he was so pissed off about the um, the settlement policy. So I took issue with that assumption that the United States was just kind of winking. Did they cut off support from their major ally in the region, which has strategic importance for the United States in terms of power projection? It is the only democracy in the region. With
Mhm.
name another.
Well, I mean, like calling it a democracy when 6 million other people that share that land don't have the right to vote or
Well, I
don't
mean,
have the right to participate in
Arabs
any of
have
the
the right.
system.
Arabs
Uh,
have the right to vote inside Israel, and they have members of the Knesset. So they do
yeah,
have.
but again,
It's a
Israel is
very,
in charge of the occupied territories,
it's a
and
very,
they're
very. So in their occupied territories, I'm not disputing anything that you say, and I'm a strong supporter of and have been for a very long time, of a Palestinian state. But within Israel proper, which is still has the boundaries of what is of a state, they have elections, they have Arabs in the parliament, they have Palestinians in the parliament, and almost every other part of the Middle East, including the Palestinian Authority and Gaza, have many fewer rights for the people who live within their borders. So sometimes there are these like inconvenient facts that complexify the arguments. And all that I'm saying, I'm not urging anybody to change their mind or, you know, decide that Israel's okay or anything like that. I'm just saying, I want people to think in time, to think contextually about. So people might say, well, why weren't the Palestinians at Camp David? A very good question. And the answer is that not only Israel, but Egypt wouldn't have gone to Camp David if the Palestinians or the Jordanians were there. It was hard enough making peace between Israel and Egypt, and it would have wrecked Camp David had they included the Palestinians directly. But since they were talking about the future of Palestine, talking about the future of the Palestinians, on first glance, it's ridiculous that the Palestinians were not at Camp David. It's preposterous that they weren't there. And Jimmy Carter would be the first one to say that. But he would also explain that the perfect can't be the enemy of the good. And since he actually wanted an agreement, he had to limit it to inviting Israel and Egypt. And even that came very, very close to failure on many, many occasions during the 13 days they were at Camp David. And then again, when Carter went back to the region in March of 1979 to try to put the Camp David Accords back together after they had been basically fallen apart. And by the way, just on Gaza, and you didn't ask this, but I'm sort of rambling on here. One of the most interesting conversations I had with Jimmy Carter involved his conversations with Hamas, which were very criticized in the United States. And actually, Obama shortened his role in the 2008 Democratic Convention because it hadn't been that much earlier that Carter had met with Hamas, and that was very unpopular, not just in the Jewish community, but in the United States as a whole, since they were a terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel. And so I asked him why, like, why would he go and meet with Hamas? And his answer was a very good one. He said, first of all, just to go back to, something we were talking about before we began the podcast, like why was Obama, acting so friendly toward Trump at the Carter funeral? And as Carter would have liked that, even though he despised Trump too, because, as Carter and I think other diplomats know, it's easy to talk to your friends. The hard thing is talking to your enemies. That's much more important if you want to keep the peace and solve problems. So I think Obama was perfectly fine in doing that. And that same thing applied to why Carter wanted to talk to Hamas. His more specific objective was to make peace not between Hamas and Israel, although he did work hard to get Hamas to try to get them to change their charter, which was committed to the destruction of Israel. But his main goal was to make peace between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And because they were and still are at odds, and he thought that the best way to achieve a Palestinian state would be for there to be one interlocutor. In other words, one representative of the Palestinian people, the way it worked when Yasser Arafat was in charge. And the split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority thought was very damaging to the longer term, even short term prospects of a Palestinian state. So I'm sorry to get off on that, but I think it tells you a little bit about the way Jimmy Carter approached these issues.
Yeah. Thank you for all of that insight. I think, we went on a tangent a bit, but like that's warranted because this is the present time that we live in, and these are
Right.
the issues that are at the forefront of many people's mind. So intentionally or unintentionally, we veered into that conversation. But I think the last thing that I want to add to this, to the points that you were making, is like there's a lot to unpack there, first of all. Many of the things you described, I don't see it that way. You use the word peace a lot of times. I do think justice is a prerequisite to any form of peace. I do think that
So can I just interrupt you on that point? You make
yes,
a very interesting point. Justice is a prerequisite to any form of peace. So people associate Jimmy Carter with human rights. He was the first leader anywhere in the world who said that the way other countries treat their own people in terms of justice and human rights should be a factor in our foreign policy. And he sometimes unevenly applied it, even hypocritically applied it because he was president during the Cold War. But that was his basic view: justice, right? Human rights, rights and justice. Then, and this fascinated me, it didn't get any attention after his death because it was a little bit down in the weeds. In the 1980s, the heads of American human rights organizations went to Atlanta, and they had a very tense meeting with Jimmy Carter because they didn't like him meeting with all these dictators. You know, the Hamas dictators, and if you don't think Hamas was a dictatorship, we need to talk more about that. If you look at the complete absence of rights among the Gazans. But Carter's view, which nobody really understands, was the direct inverse of what you're talking about. So he said peace is a prerequisite for justice. In other
Yeah,
words, until
that's
you
easy to
get
say when you have peace, though, when you have rights,
no,
when
no, 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 no. It's
like
not easy
because
to
it's
say.
like
It's
it's
easy,
if we're
not
gonna talk
easy.
about if we're
No,
gonna
but wait
talk
a minute, wait
about
a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Let me just finish my point, Hami, because this is
okay.
a really important, really, to me, a really compelling argument to have.
Hmm.
So, and I'm not sure that Carter was right about it. I think the human rights advocates, they had a lot, their argument too. They said, why are you meeting with these dictators? You're giving them a platform. They are repressing their people. There's no justice in their society. Why are you meeting with them? And his answer was, until the bullets stop flying, you can't get to human rights and justice. You have to have the bullets, you have to have peace before you can make these desperately needed improvements in society. And you can't get, and this is what, I mean, this is one of the great ironies of Palestinian history in the last 60 years, which so many Palestinians did not understand, that if they'd taken a leaf from Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, they would have had a Palestinian state
But they have done
a long
that.
time ago.
They
They
have
didn't
done that
do it.
multiple times during 2018
They
and
didn't.
2020. Like they were Gazans were marching to the border peacefully and they were sniped in the kneecap. If you review the UN reports and the human
But
rights
what
reports,
do you mean? I
like
mean, there was no occupation of Gaza. So what do you mean marching to
I
the
mean,
border?
like that
What?
also depends who you ask, right? Like many other scholars would tell you that Gaza is still occupied territory because they're occupied on their border, they're besieged by land, sea, water. Israel control the magnetic fields. Like it really
That's all
depends.
true. I'm not
I mean,
disputing
like, yeah.
anything.
And so
But
if also
but
if
I
you want to
wasn't
talk
talking about
about
Gaza.
if you
I
want to
wasn't
talk
talking
about the
about
bullets
Gaza and
stopping,
justice.
then that means like I agree with you. The
I
bullets
wasn't
need to
talking about
stop.
Gaza and justice. I was talking about Palestinian
Yeah,
justice
but Gaza is part of
overall
the
over the last
Palestinian
50 years.
Gaza is part
Yeah.
of the Palestinian fabric. Gaza was didn't magically appear out of nowhere, like Palestinians were violently displaced and dispossessed from their homes through
Yeah.
a system of colonization and dispossession and forced to move into Gaza, which was then surrounded and enclaved, and that created Gaza. It's not something that
Yeah.
appeared out
I
of
mean,
thin air.
I'm happy
But
to
I agree with
argue
you
all this. I
on
mean,
the point. I
it was,
agree. Can I
yeah,
just finish this one
yeah.
point? I agree with you that we can't talk about peace if the bullets are not stopping. So I think on that end, we're on the same page that we need a ceasefire now. And Biden's constantly sending 2,000-pound bombs and all sorts of weapons that and not using diplomacy to the biggest end that like to the best end that we can and putting that forth and reneging on his red line that he's drawing. For example, when he tells Netanyahu, um, don't go into Rafah, and Netanyahu goes into Rafah, he says, let food and humanitarian aid in. Netanyahu says, nah, the hell with that. I'm not doing that.
But so
And
what should Biden have done
he
on
needs to
that?
be
So
he needs to be tougher on that. Like
what can he
we
do
are the
then?
world
Besides,
superpower. We provide the military. Our tax
yeah,
dollars provide
yeah.
the weapons. We provide the intelligence. We provide the support. We provide the diplomatic cover. We veto all the UN ceasefire resolutions. Like this is as much our problem as it is Netanyahu and Israel's problem. Like we are hand in hand. So we bear as much moral responsibility as they do. So we need to be able to be honest with ourselves and not just be like, okay, Biden tried and we need to contextualize this and contextualize that because children are dying. Children are getting sniped according to the reports of of doctors that have been to Gaza. And so it's not about like editorializing about how, Biden and contextualizing him in the situation. The real material thing is uh people have been killed in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, no,
And
I'm not
people are still,
disputing,
you
not
know,
disputing any of that. And I accept your point that the United States could definitely have done more when these red lines were crossed. And I'm especially upset by the failure of the humanitarian assistance. And I think the United States should have used many of the, as you quite rightly said, many of the forces that we have to create true humanitarian corridors and to make it, I mean, the idea of,
and we even need to question, why do we need humanitarian corridors? We need humanitarian corridors because we've created a situation that requires it. If we didn't create that situation that requires it in the first place, right? And even I want to talk about Camp David
yeah, I know
after this because
we should get to Camp David
yeah,
because
let's go back to Camp David
we could argue
because
about this all day and I have to
yeah,
go
because
fairly
this is a
soon.
perfect example of like we are not creating the conditions that brew peace. And Jimmy Carter, from my perspective, saw that. He saw that involving the Palestinians in any kind of peace negotiations is the fundamental issue here. And in his interviews with Democracy Now! That I was watching, and his interviews with NPR, he says it. He says
Oh, of course.
um,
Nowadays, yeah,
Americans and
absolutely
Israelis
right.
don't want to see the Palestinians and their plight. And he talks.
I agree. I agree with Carter on that.
Yeah. And so like
And
why are they making deals with Egypt? The issue is not with Egypt. Why are they making deals in
no,
the
no,
Abraham
there's,
Accords?
you know what?
Back then. I'm talking
Egypt
about
has a
now.
border. Oh, why were they making deals then with
No, no, no.
Egypt?
I'm talking about like back
Uh,
then, right? Like you made a peace with Egypt, great, beautiful,
yeah,
but like
yeah.
Jimmy Carter was saying, like that's not the root of the issue here,
No,
right?
he's right.
And then
He's
you
right.
think
And
about Trump.
he felt that at the time. This is one of the complexities of Camp David that I think people don't understand. Like when I talked to Carter about Camp David, he was not, oh, this is my great accomplishment. He was like, if I'd been reelected, my main focus would have been a comprehensive Middle East peace.
Mhm.
And it's tragic that the peace process that was launched at Camp David has borne so little fruit. And it really was the great disappointment of his life, what we're talking about, that he couldn't get justice for the Palestinians. And he compared the um, plight of the Palestinians to the plight of Black people in the South in the United States. And that's why, and the North. And that's what gave it its emotional power for Jimmy Carter. So all that I'm saying when I say that,
Yeah.
in quoting Carter saying that peace is a prerequisite for justice, when he was talking to Hamas, he was trying for peace. Okay. So people have to understand that, and I heard this because he was still alive on October 7th. It was of last year. He had another year to live, more than a year to live, and he was still totally compos mentis. And so Carter was for a ceasefire. He was by far the most pro-Palestinian president we've had. It's not saying very much. Uh, and he worked for justice for the Palestinians
Mhm.
for almost 50 years. I mean, when he was early in his presidency, he said the Palestinians need their own state. It will take a while to get there. And when he said this publicly, there was obviously, a huge blowback, and he was ahead of his time on that. But people have to understand that I talked to somebody in late October of 2023, and they were very clear about how upset Jimmy Carter was by October 7th. Very, very clear. It wasn't like, oh, well, this is what happens when you're deprived of your rights. This is what happens. That was not Jimmy Carter's view. It was, this was butchery. And he also believed correctly that Hamas has completely screwed themselves. This will be considered one of the dumbest tactical, much less, you know, elements of a fight for justice for their people of modern times. He was appalled by it because he knew not just the way Israel would react, but he knew what would happen to hundreds of thousands of innocent people as a result. So he felt that Hamas should have, when I had a long conversation with him about Hamas, and he had a real problem with their idea that violence was a solution to the problems of the region. And so you have to be able to hold these like two ideas in your mind at the same time, that we need justice, but first you have to do it through peace, and then you maybe you do put pressure on Israel to, you threaten and to cut off aid to Israel. There are many different things you can do, or even cut off aid to Israel. There are many different things you can do to advance the peace process, but it has to be done peacefully. And
Okay,
sometimes
we get
people kind of lose sight of this. And the reason I'm dwelling on this is that when people think about Jimmy Carter, the thing they have to understand is peace was always first with him. One of his closest aides said he was close to being a pacifist. And one of the things he was proudest of is that nobody died in combat when he was president. So he prioritized human life over everything. And I think it's just very important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that analysis. I'm gonna move us on.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll go another, I can stay longer, Hami, because we got sidetracked. I don't
okay.
want to change your questions.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Since you have more time, I'm gonna make a final point and then get your reaction to that.
Okay.
And then we'll move
Yeah.
on to the other issues, to the other questions that I had about Jimmy Carter's life. You when you brought up the Jim Crow South,
Yeah.
and how that shaped Jimmy Carter, that also makes me think about, what we're supporting, right? Because that's telling me, like, because you use the word that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And so I'm asking myself, okay, so do we consider the United
Barely, I
States?
should say, barely a democracy.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the point I was gonna make, because by that logic, when I didn't have the right to vote, or my ancestors
We didn't
didn't
have
have
a
the right,
democracy in the United States.
right? So if we're judging the United States by those standards, when blacks didn't have the
Right.
same rights, inalienable rights
Yeah,
as
yeah.
whites in this
Yeah,
country,
totally agree.
then by that same logic, it's not a democracy as long as the Palestinians don't have the same inalienable rights on that land, because right now they don't have a state in which they can govern themselves. And we can talk about that long history, but we don't have time for that.
No, but just
Um,
on that point, it's very, very interesting point. So I am one of those people who says that the United States did not have what you could fairly consider to be a democracy until 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. That if you have states in the Union that are, that have, you know, literally a dozen black registered voters, Mississippi and Alabama, that's not a democracy. But here's the difference. Those states were part of the United States. They were not territories of the United States, in
Under
Guam.
international law,
So
if you occupy a territory, you are in charge of that territory, and you are in charge of the people that are living within the borders of those territories. Now, if Israel decided to give up occupation today, and Israel decided to remove its barriers and borders from
It
all the
did from
places
it
that it
did from
occupied.
Gaza. It did from Gaza, and
I
they so
mean, it relocated its troops from
it's
inside of
that's
Gaza to
it
around
wasn't
Gaza.
it wasn't occupied anymore.
Uh,
Sometimes there are these
international
inconvenient facts. It
international
wasn't occupied.
organizations
It
differ
wasn't
on that.
occupied.
Well,
On the
okay,
West Bank, you're absolutely right.
let's leave Gaza
Yeah, yeah,
outside. But
yeah.
even if it's just the West Bank that we're looking at, even if
Yes.
it's just East Jerusalem that we're looking at, same conversation, same
I'm
logic
not
applies.
disputing you that they've persecuted people in on the West Bank and in East Jerusalem.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, that's why I use the word barely, but they do have like they do have.
I mean, you can't barely have a democracy. So either you
Well,
have a
that's what in the
democracy
United
or you don't.
States. That's what no, no, that we disagree on that. So the United States until 1965 barely had a democracy. It didn't have what you could consider to be anything more than barely until 1965. And I would say the same thing for Israel. Until Palestinians on the West Bank are given their full rights, until they have a state, you cannot say that Israel is a full democracy. But you can also make some comparisons, and these comparisons are never made about the rights that Arabs have within Israel proper
Yeah,
compared to the rights they have in other countries.
Arabs have
Yeah,
also given their own, like Arabs can speak for themselves. You and I don't need to speak for them. And a lot of the things that Palestinians that live in Proper 48 have given testimonies on is that by law they are treated as second class citizens, just like blacks were in certain period of time in the United States. By law,
not just like
I mean,
blacks.
I
If
mean, like,
you're a Palestinian, so I don't know how many times you've been to Israel and the Middle East, but if
of
you go
course,
to
I haven't
Israel,
been
like
there, but I'm
when I was
saying like
there,
I
like
do know Palestinians.
I hung out with a Palestinian newscaster, very popular on
Mhm.
Israeli TV. So you would not have had that in the Jim Crow South. So we need to be a little bit, you know,
Yeah.
cognizant of the fact that some of these, as I said earlier in the conversation, it's sometimes really easy to make these cross-cultural analogies. And that's what the title of the course that I took in college, the uses and misuses of history.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what people do is they make these comparisons in a very blithe way, and then they try to kind of argue with, it's sort of the way the Trumpsters, use whataboutism. Like
Okay, I agree with
argue
you.
with
I
these
agree
other
with you.
examples.
We don't need
Yeah,
to make comparisons. We
right,
don't need to use
right.
whataboutism. My
Yeah.
point is the conditions are bad enough
They're bad. They're
as
bad.
it
We're not
is.
disagreeing. We're not
As it
disagreeing.
is. So
Yeah.
that's that.
I just, I
Um,
just, I'm just making an argument. I just wanted to be clear since we're talking about Jimmy Carter that, you know, where he drew the line on, and, you know, in the last 30 years of his life, 35 years of his life, no
mhm,
more, he had real problems with Israeli policy far beyond what anybody in government did. And he was very, very forthright on Democracy Now! And in many other places in our conversations. So that assessment of him is correct, that he was a true champion of Palestinian rights. But people need to understand
mhm.
that peace was first and always first with
So
him.
why
And
wasn't Jimmy Carter able to accomplish that?
um, so part of it was that at Camp David, Menachem Begin wasn't on the level. He basically lied to him. He lied to Carter at
And
Camp
for
David.
those of our viewers who don't know who Menachem Begin is, could
Uh,
you give a little context?
yeah, Menachem Begin was a Polish Jew by birth, who was imprisoned and persecuted by both the communists, and then he fled the Nazis and made his way to Palestine, where he became part of a violent offshoot of the Irgun, and was involved in a terrorist act in blowing up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. as part of their efforts to achieve independence from Great Britain, which ran Palestine at that time. Carter felt betrayed by Begin, by Menachem Begin at Camp David, because Carter knew that if Begin didn't stop these settlements,
Mm.
which, just so I'm clear, I believe they were Israeli colonialist settlements on the West Bank, that there could never be peace. And Begin led him to believe that that he would limit the settlements, um, but he wasn't being on the level.
Yeah.
So Begin, it's important to understand though that Begin, as Carter told me, gave up much more at Camp David than Sadat did. Remember, the Israeli army had occupied the Sinai Peninsula, which is many times larger than Israel. It's mostly desert, but it was a huge chunk of territory. And as part of Camp David, they not only stopped the remaining occupation of the Sinai, but they forced the Israeli settlers in the Sinai to take down their settlements. And that was a very hard pill for Begin to swallow, that he had to tell all of these Israelis who had been living in some cases for a number of years in the Sinai, no, you can't live there anymore as part of this agreement to come back to Israel. So he had given up a lot at Camp David, and he later tried to renege on it. And that's why Carter had to go back to the region and put the whole piece back together again, which almost nobody knows about. It was another sort of brilliant act of diplomacy by Jimmy Carter. But he did kind of double cross Jimmy Carter on the issue of the Palestinians, much less the Palestinians themselves, who had very good reason for feeling that they had been wrongly excluded from Camp David, and they were perfectly. It was completely understandable why they resented being excluded from that part of the peace process, but it wouldn't have simply would not have happened at that stage if they had been included. And what was established at Camp David was the process, which later resulted in the Oslo Accords, uh, peace with Jordan, which was very important for the Palestinians, and ultimately the Abraham Accords that we had more recently under Trump, which was literally the only good thing that happened under Trump. The the I think that the one of the maybe the single greatest disappointment of Jimmy Carter's life is that he was unable, because of the complexities of it and mostly because of the intransigence of Israel, he was not able to get the comprehensive Middle East peace and a Palestinian state that he had dreamed of. And he had first gone to the Middle East when he was governor of Georgia. He always called it the Holy Land, and it was the great dream of his life that
Mm.
all people could live there in peace.
Yes. Thank you so much. First of all, for your patience and for your analysis. The next thing I wanted to talk, I have three more things I want to talk about, then I'll let you
Okay.
go if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds
Um,
good.
I want to talk about the